Hi everyone, and welcome to this Festival of Future City event run by Bristol Ideas, asking how would cities be different if they were designed by women? My name's Sian Norris. I'm the Chief Social Affairs Reporter at Byline Times and the founder of the Bristol Women's Literature Festival. You can watch our festival events online and in person this year, so if you enjoy today's event and want to discover more, please sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. So we have an absolutely fantastic panel today. I'm really thrilled to be joined by so many brilliant women who are doing very exciting work looking at architecture, economics, geography, and all sorts of subjects. We have Jos Boys, who is the Senior Lecturer in Environments for Learning in the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction at University College London. She was a founding member of the Matrix Feminist Architecture and Research Collective in the 80s, and one of the authors of Making Space, Women and the Man-Made Environment. Since then, she's worked as a journalist, researcher, consultant, educator, and photographer, and has published several books. And she's also the co-founder and director of the Disordinary Architecture Project, which brings disabled artists into architectural education and practice to critically and creatively rethink access and inclusion. We're also joined by Leslie Kern, who is an Associate Professor of Geography and Environment and the Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University. She is the author of Sex and the Revitalized City, Gender, Condominium Development and Urban Citizenship, and most recently, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. And finally, we have Katrine Marçal, who is a best-selling author on women and innovation. Her first book, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner?, has been translated into more than 20 languages and was named one of The Guardian's Books of the Year in 2015. And her most recent book is Mother of Invention, How Good Ideas Get Ignored in an Economy Built for Men. And she works for the Swedish newspaper, and apologies if I pronounce this wrong, Dagens Nyheter. So thank you. I hope everyone in our virtual audience will join me in a quick round of applause for our great panel. So we're here today to talk about how would cities be different if they were designed by women. And I think it's really important that when we talk about this subject, we look at the challenges, we look at the things that aren't going well in terms of design and women's inclusivity and women's access. But we also want to think about solutions and think about different ways that we can include women and make sure that our city landscape is built with women in mind. So hopefully we'll get a good balance of kind of problems and solutions. But Jos, I really wanted to start with you because, as we mentioned, you set up the Matrix Feminist Design Co-Operative in the 1980s. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what inspired the cooperative and why you set it up, and what were the kind of issues and challenges you faced at the time?
Well, when I think back to the early days of Matrix, and I was a co-founder with a much larger group of women in London in the 1980s, I think that there were kind of three interconnecting concerns that we shared with lots of differences and lots of kind of different kinds of emphases. But I think, first of all, it was that the architectural and planning professions themselves needed to change, that we had to explore new and more equitable ways of working within the professions. And we wanted to bring in a kind of different kind of practice that wasn't pretending that design was neutral and that professional decision-making was the way to go, but that rather connected across construction planning, got involved in much wider networks, got involved in events, education, and most importantly, I think that worked directly and collaboratively with women's and community groups. And that was by using really simple techniques such as demountable models so that non-experts could be really equally involved in design development. So that was the first thing. The second thing, I think, was that in enabling women's and other disadvantaged groups, by supporting them in, it was a time with the GLC when it was possible to develop quite ambitious funding applications, for example, that actually opened up new sorts of spaces that hadn't previously existed before or hardly had existed. Women's centres, women's refuges, and different and more radical forms of childcare. I think that the kind of one of the great things that I never worked for design practice, but except the very early days, but I'm very, I think that those projects still stand as very strong because of the way that they came out of what the clients and users were able to develop in terms of their needs and requirements. And I think the third thing, which I guess was the bit I was most involved in, was how you bring together theory and practice. So I was mainly part of the book group, which was Making Space Women in the Man-Made Environment, which was published by Pluto in 1984 and will be republished by Verso as a feminist classic next year. And that was really part of a group of us trying to work out just how the built environment is gendered and how it is raced and how it is ableist. And how it intersects with poverty at a time when words like sexist didn't even exist. And for me, I was particularly interested in a kind of set of tensions and complexities really around how cities were still being designed based on gender stereotypes of the kind of middle-class white housewife in the suburbs and her husband commuting to work in the centre. And the fact that that was already a really dated model by the time we wrote the book. There were many other kinds of households, and many white middle-class women like me had been going into higher education in much larger numbers than, say, before the Second World War. And we really wanted a lot more opportunities.
And so when you say that the cities were sort of still being designed according to these kind of gendered stereotypes, like, do you have any examples of what that looked like in terms of city design and which stereotypes it was meeting?
Well, in that period, I think that was really interesting. If you look at the Making Space book, you'll see work by people like Sue Francis on the kind of housing design guides that were written at the time. And they're completely created around an idea that the woman is at the home, in the home, she doesn't have a job, that she's looking after the children, that she's doing the housework, and the man, they're little drawings of people, and the man goes out, he disappears in most of the pictures, and then he comes back in and he's sitting in a chair watching the television. So there's literally a way in which housing design embedded that an assumption of those kinds of relationships. And although we can obviously live in our buildings and our spaces, beyond the way that the stereotypes define them, I think that those were some really straightforward ways, whether you think about the master bedroom or the tiny kitchen, which was kind of, assumed that there'd be the woman, one person working in it, sightlines designed around the woman being able to watch the children while she was doing the housework, those kinds of things, I think.
And was this really coming from, do you think, the fact that the profession was very male dominated and white dominated? And, do you think that things have changed? Have we seen inroads in terms of representation within the sector that is leading to positive change about how we think about cities and gender?
I think we are seeing inroads. We're seeing it in terms of many more women, although they're still not, running their own practices to the same degree. They're not in the same positions of power. It's still a real problem for people of colour who want to be architects. It's really, the numbers are still very low. And it's still, for me, it's a very class-based thing. It's it's about certain sorts of assumptions, middle and upper class English assumptions. The English are very class, that's still very strong. And so I think that you can see the numbers changing. The numbers have definitely changed, but in terms of unconscious bias and stereotyping in design, I think that there's still many things kind of haven't shifted. Some things have, and some things haven't. And I'm sure Leslie and Katrine will both have things to say about that.
Leslie, I wanted to move on to ask you about your book, The Feminist City. And I kind of thought it'd be interesting to start with the question, like, what is a feminist city? Why did you decide to pose this question? And what were you hoping to find out by looking at what a feminist city could be?
Well, I think in many ways, I was simply picking up on the work of groups like Matrix and so many other, feminist urban scholars and geographers that even going back prior to the work that Matrix had done, that these questions have been asked. And unfortunately, it does seem as though we need to keep asking them, and we need to keep making both the argument that gender inequalities are very much built into cities and that we need to do something to change them. So one of the things that's been interesting is how many people say, oh, I really wish I had heard about this before, when I was in school. And I think, well, you could have, if it was integrated, these ideas are not new. I didn't sort of come up with anything out of whole cloth in this book. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a very, long trajectory of women and feminists and other folks thinking critically about this. But, my aim in Feminist City was to once again bring these ideas hopefully to a wide audience of people, to sort of anyone who's living in a city and might want to move through it kind of with a fresh set of eyes and to question the things that we take for granted. Jo's mentioned housing, right? Why do we continue to build housing around the model of a traditional nuclear family? Why are our transportation systems still set up largely with the idea of a commuter coming from the suburbs to the city on a 9 to 5 rush hour schedule, making a linear trip without caregiving responsibilities, and so many other things that when we start to look at them, we can, see these traces of sexism, racism, colonialism, and so on built right in. So then the question is, what is a feminist city? Well, obviously it would be one in which there is kind of not one main group that is both dominant in terms of the process of design and building and planning, but also, not one group that is taken as the universal standard or the norm by which all the spaces and infrastructure and elements of the city that we engage with, that they're assumed to be the ones that we kind of model the day-to-day experience of city life after. And for too long, that has been, a cis, white, hetero, able-bodied, middle-class man that we've imagined. I think, there's so many things that I could say about what a feminist city is, but maybe one that I'll highlight because it's become so tangible in new ways to many people during the pandemic is the world of care work and the way in which care work is very much an afterthought in most formal city planning. I would say it's probably an afterthought in a lot of architecture and design professions. We still have this assumption that care work is done mostly unpaid or poorly paid in the home or other kind of private spaces, and that it's not really the job of planners and designers and civil engineers and all of these other people to think about where care work happens, who does it, how it's paid, how it's valued, and so on. So to me, one of the things that has come up again and again in conversations about the feminist city is how do we change that? And it's not just about, getting men in heterosexual relationships to pick up more of the slack at home, although they should definitely do that. But that is not maybe the full revolution that I think the idea of the feminist city is looking for. I'm interested in thinking about how we can kind of turn the home inside out in terms of some of this care work. And by that, I don't mean, let's unload it onto more, poorly paid, assumed to be low-skilled, vulnerable, marginalized workers. I mean, how can we bring it into the public sphere? How can we collectivize it? How can we truly value it and make it everybody's responsibility, a true sense of interdependence, a true recognition that without care work, this thing that we call the economy that we've all been asked to sacrifice so much for, well, forever, but especially in the last year and a half, that it doesn't exist without all of this labor. So to me, thinking about the feminist city is, care work is very key to that. Yeah.
It's so interesting because I think, as you say, like when we think about cities and infrastructure, it's still this kind of, getting to work, consumption, or, buying things and moving from place to place without really engaging with the space. And actually how we care and how we look after other people is crucial to how we live in a city. And yet it's seen as something domestic or indoors or out of sight, out of mind. And one of the things with the pandemic that I really noticed was how narrow pavements are, because we've talked about this a lot in terms of feminist cities, like having wide pavements to give access to people in wheelchairs, but also with caregivers and pushchairs. And, you know, now we all have to get out of each other's way and stand 2 meters apart, and you're on this tiny little pavement, and you sort of really brings home how this is something that could be simply resolved and just hasn't ever been considered. Katrine, obviously your book is very much about innovation and invention and how gendered thinking has held back innovation. There's just so many fantastic examples in the book, from spacesuits to, you know, the initial car designs. And I love the descriptions of the old-fashioned cars of women going out and sort of having their lunch dates in these huge horseless carriages. But in terms of cities, like, how do you think sort of gendered thinking and that kind of underlying and also obvious sexism has led to us missing out on innovations in how we think about city living and city planning?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm coming at this from an economic point of view. So that's sort of my angle. I'm a financial journalist, and that's what I've written about. And I mean, just to tie into the previous two speakers, you know, we ask ourselves, you know, why are cities not designed with care work in mind? And I mean, to me at least, I mean, all of that boils down to economics. We do not, you know, account for care work. It's not counted. It's not unpaid care work is not considered to be something that contributes to wealth in like official economic statistics. You know, if women's unpaid care work was counted, that's, you know, $11 trillion US. You know, obviously, if it was an official industry worth $11 trillion, we would be designing for that, you know, as we do, you know, in London for the financial sector or something like that. So, I mean, I think, and that's, I guess, the perspective I can contribute with here in this conversation is that, you know, so much of this does boil down to economics, and especially with cities being these, you know, huge engines of economic growth, but also of, you know, of inequality, right? You know, inequality levels tend to be bigger within cities. So, but your question about design and innovation, I mean, I guess the main point in my new book, Mother of Invention, is how forces of technology or technological development is something that we sort of often talk about and treat as if it was this neutral thing. You know, technology is coming along, sort of pushing all of us along, and all we can do is adapt ourselves, as, you know, Leslie was saying, or adapt our economies, or adapt our societies, and certainly sort of adapt our cities. And the role sort of to, you know, that policymakers sort of have towards, you know, technology and innovation is more sort of predicting, you know, how many jobs will the robots take, or, you know, what kind of transport is coming, as if this was this neutral thing. And what I try to break down in Mother of Invention is, you know, using all of these historical examples, is that, you know, the forces of technology and the forces of innovation are, you know, incredibly gendered, because obviously it's human beings, you know, coming up with all of these ideas, and markets consisting of human beings with all of their ideas about male and female, choosing, you know, like I talk about in the book, even in the 1800s when electric cars first came around, they were, as you mentioned, considered to be sort of a mode of transport for women. And as soon as something is considered to be feminine or female, then it's often considered to be, you know, less than. And this was actually one of the reasons why electric cars were not adapted, you know, already more than 100 years ago as solutions for particularly urban environments to which they would have been very suited. And we've gone from a, you know, a world where, you know, 120 years ago, you could phone up an electric cab company in London, to a world where, you know, that's not happening yet. So by showing in the book that these forces of technology are very gendered, hopefully that's a way of making people look at innovation in a different way. And I mean, one example from cities is, so I'm from Sweden, and one of the things that has really transformed the urban environments of Stockholm in the last couple of years are electric scooters. They're everywhere. and they're almost completely unregulated. And in some ways, they're a great form of sustainable transport, but based on this idea that this is the new technology, we shouldn't sort of regulate it. They're everywhere, and people in wheelchairs or with buggies, can't get through. And it's really been something that's kind of, ruined the environment in the city for a lot of people. And still this argument is there. Well, that's the next thing. It's technology, it's innovation, so we can't shape it. But what I argue in the book is that we are already shaping it.
I think the electric scooters example is a really interesting one. Viewers who are watching us from Bristol will know that they are here. The Voice scooters are everywhere in the city, it seems. But it feels like one of those innovations that's come in about green technology. We need to be more sustainable. We need to be greener. We need to get people out of cars and into these other modes of transport, but actually hasn't thought about inclusion and accessibility, and particularly for women and disabled people. And, where do you think that sort of blindness comes from in these planning decisions?
Well, I mean, with the scooters, I think it comes from, the Voi scooters are a product, for example, of a venture capital economy where entrepreneurs come in and say, we have this idea for these electric scooters. And if they are white and male, they often have an ability to raise billions and billions of pounds, and then get these scooter companies and just put the scooters everywhere in our cities. So that is, a direct effect of a venture capital system where in the UK, women only get 2% of all venture capital. I think it's 2 point something. In Sweden, it's less. It's 1%. So that's sort of innovation being, at the starting level, extremely shaped by an environment where women are, just not there. So obviously, I don't think it's hard to imagine that if all the founders of these scooter companies tend to be white and male, that they don't think about the wider implications. But your other question about policymakers, I think a lot of that has to do with that you want to be perceived as, I'm in favor of sustainability, I'm in favor of the technology of the future, and this is a good thing. And at least that's been sort of the argument in Sweden around them. And I do think that is very counterproductive, because now so many people hate those scooters, which could have been part of a really sustainable solution.
Look, I'd quite like to extend that argument, because I think that's absolutely right. And I think we also need to add in bicycles, because bicycles seem, better, and we've got bike lanes. And bicycles, there is something fantastic about bicycles. But the kind of assumption around bicycles and the lack of, say, gender budgeting about, who is actually using them, again, it is men that have much higher rates of use. And it's not that they're wrong, but if you think about something else, so that's very much a policy. It's become such common sense policy. It's like that's the way you look like you're on top of things by investing in cycle lanes in many big cities. But the same thing doesn't happen, say, around public toilets, public restrooms, because and that's very interesting to me, because they would have huge health and well-being benefits for a very large number of people, and make being able to use cities and streets just open to people who actually often don't go out. Because they're worried that they won't be able to find a facility. But it's not very, doesn't sound very sexy, doesn't sound very hip. You could make a big sustainability argument, I think, but it's those things about what gets valued and what doesn't, also, at the level of a kind of mindset that just becomes a new normal, and doesn't, and in terms of always stopping and thinking about what is being valued and counted and what isn't. I think, as you both do, Leslie and Katrine, we need to be endlessly reviewing, kind of really critically reviewing all those things that just become seem to be good with just unproblematically good.
I mean, the public toilet issue is another one, I think, that really came to the fore in lockdown. And when I was reliving my teenage years drinking in parks because the pubs were closed, and then suddenly like, oh, I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to have to go home because there's nowhere to use a bathroom. And I noticed that you saw a lot more men on the streets, like drinking and socializing in the kind of in-between bit of lockdown than you did women. And because you just didn't have access to the same facilities that you need. And I mean, that sort of brings me to another question around access to public space and cities. I mean, one of the big issues facing women is violence against women, obviously, and this sense that if you are out on the streets, out in the city, you are vulnerable to male violence, even though we know that the majority of women who experience gender-based violence will do so in their own homes. And what does this tell us about women's access to public space? And what would a city look like if women's safety was put at the fore and we weren't living with these kind of safety warnings of go home before it's dark, always get a taxi, use the buddy system? And Leslie, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right that both actual violence and perhaps even more so the fear of violence and the sort of socially produced fear of violence are factors that limit women's ability to, be out in public space, to move through public space in the ways that they want to enjoy public space in the ways that other people, particularly white men, are more able to do. It does continue to be a limiting factor. It's one of those questions. I like to think that if we could have designed out fear and crime by now, we would have. And unfortunately, so many of the solutions that cities tend to be attracted to involve, over-policing, involve shutting down public space, right? Like removing benches, removing toilets, removing areas where people gather, because we think if we can limit somehow people's ability to gather, then we're going to, create a less crime-prone environment, when really kind of the opposite is true. We've thrown so much budget, especially in many Western cities, into kind of like anti-terror infrastructure and architecture in cities that just makes the urban environment feel kind of hostile and hardened and very unwelcoming, very nowhere to sit and relax and enjoy yourself. So the design interventions that we've come up with, I think in many ways have often been the opposite of what I would think like a feminist city vision of safety would be about. And of course, the other piece of the puzzle is the much more difficult to tackle cultural and social norms that, continue to, put forward a very toxic version of masculinity that is based around, aggression and dominance over women. And I don't think cities are powerless to act in that capacity, but it's not, something that is sort of generally under the purview of a planning office. So we have to be thinking about a couple of things, one of which is, a much broader societal response, but also a really intersectional view, which does not place women's safety and some women, a small group of white, middle class privileged women, their safety at the top of the hierarchy, and throws everyone else under the bus or makes cities less safe for them by the kinds of things that we invest in. So to me, I mean, ultimately, and I take, this learning from abolition movements and Black Lives Matter, whether it's defunding the police, which I do believe in, or defunding and refunding other things, that those are the greatest contributors to safety, right? If we have, everyone has access to housing, everyone has access to food, everyone has access to education and healthcare, and the income that they need to live on. Those are the things that will improve safety from the ground up, not these kind of top-down, patch and fix or police type interventions.
And Jos, I was wondering if you could speak a little to that as well, because you mentioned at the beginning about with the cooperative looking at things around women's refuges and spaces for childcare. And, how do you feel that, we're still not there in terms of investing in cities that create safe spaces and supportive spaces for women? And whereas perhaps in the 80s and in the second wave of feminism, there was such an energy towards creating that space and making space where there was none before.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think in the 80s, some of these things in terms of like the women's refugee movement was really important and very powerful, but in many ways equally important was, and connected to it, was an idea that domestic violence was just unacceptable, and that you could no longer just assume it was fine for a man to beat his wife, which, when I was young was the assumption that was just, that's just what happened, really. And I feel that those things come along together. I completely support what Leslie said. So although I think we were interested in making spaces that enabled women to have the lives that they wanted, and that being a diverse set of lives, I think that I'm also of the opinion that really when we start talking about safe space, and particularly when we talk about safe space for women, we're in territory that's quite problematic. And for me, it is, what we should be talking about is how we bring up our boys and men to behave differently, equally. Again, as Leslie says, how do we stop violence against people of colour, by really taking account of white privilege and entitlement, and making it the responsibility. So, safety for women is the responsibility of men, heterosexual men, and safety for people of colour is the responsibility of white people. For me, that's, and I think I would also feel that we've really moved beyond the kind of technical solution. The idea that the way you make places safe is, Oscar Newman's Defensible Space, or Alice Coleman's, somebody else may remember what that book's called, but I can't. A lot of writing that was going on in that period, which was really pushing for a technical solution. I think we have to see that it's a process, not a design solution.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things, isn't it? As women, we can't just speak amongst ourselves about safety and challenging attitudes. It has to come from men. And as you say, in terms of racialized violence, we have to think about white privilege and who has access to space and who's being excluded from space. Katrine, I was wondering if there were sort of any economic arguments around women's safety in cities and the impact that women's potential exclusion from public space is having economically.
I'm sure there are. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, cities being these enormous engines of growth, and if growth is good, it's not the only value, but and you can talk about how you should define it and measure it, and that's a whole different conversation. But obviously, if women are not able to, or feel that they can move around in the same way, or people of color, can't, that has economic implications too. So I'm sure there are such studies. It's nothing that I'm, aware of right now. But on a sort of separate note, I do think that there are. I don't know who mentioned sort of care earlier, and the importance of doing that differently. And also you wanted this to be on a hopeful note. I do think that there are sort of two big sort of economic opportunities now, or two big economic shifts that provide an opportunity to radically change our cities. And the first one being sort of the work from home, shifting barriers for, not everyone obviously, but for large chunks of the population, are looking to sort of probably work from home a few days in the week, and that kind of the business paradigm around that is changing. And as was mentioned earlier, cities are still sort of thought of as, a place you commute from your home to the office, and where, and where you do what you do with your children is like an afterthought. And all of that is messing with it and changing these things. And so I think that is one opportunity. And the other one obviously being the climate emergency and the energy transition. And, there are some exciting things happening in Europe with, Hamburg and Germany, setting targets of becoming a car-free city and all of these things. So I do think these are two big forces, working lives changing for many people, which will also change how we use space. And then obviously the fact that we need to try to do something with with the climate emergency, which will also require us to rethink things on a very fundamental level. So I do think those are two sort of big opportunities.
That was fantastic, because you perfectly lined up my next question, which is the feminist city, is a city designed for women, a green city? And Leslie, I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, yeah, in many ways, I do believe it is, or it can be, although as the story about scooters illustrated, a lot of the kind of embrace of certain assumptions about what is green and what is better has been done without much of a gender equity or racial equity analysis attached to it. But I think globally, women have lower carbon footprints than men in many cases. Women, tend to already use public transit more, to take more pedestrian journeys, to be more, because of their socially prescribed roles in the home, they're more involved in, recycling and energy efficiency projects. There are already lots of ways in which we could, look at the ways in which women live their lives as potential kind of models for that. But I think, there's no future vision of the feminist city that doesn't reckon with the climate emergency. And I think part of, I think there's a lot of opportunity when we talk about things like the problem of the single family home, or the problems, right? All of the unfairness of unpaid care labor, the, risk of violence to women and children in the home, but also it's not a very efficient way to live, right? In terms of both energy resources, but also human energy resources that we pour into all of the cooking and cleaning and laundry and everything that we do for a tiny number of people, right? Which is still a tremendous amount of work. But there are ways that we could scale that up. We could collectivize it, which would help with what I talked about earlier, the care burdens, but it could also be much more environmentally friendly to, cook food en masse and have less food waste, which, a third of global food supplies are wasted every year, right? To, use less water in household tasks like washing and cleaning, if these are done collectively and through, shared spaces and so on. So I think there's tremendous overlap between some of the visions and goals of a feminist city and of a more environmentally sustainable city.
And Jos, in your work, oh, sorry, Katrine, did you want to jump in?
No. Go to Jos first.
Well, I was going to ask, in your work, particularly when you were with the cooperative, were green issues very much on the agenda, and how are you thinking about eco and sustainable solutions in terms of women's access to space and building cities around women?
I think green issues were around, very much so, but they tended to be under the notion of self-sufficiency. So they were connected to a particular way of reframing one's relationship to the world, and they were in some ways individualistic, I think, in terms of the way that climate change and one's response to it was understood, in the sense that you might just escape from, get off grid, really. So that was there was some, I think those debates were around, and in fact many of the women who were originally involved in Matrix now do, and Thorn Architects have done hugely sustainable projects, and which are themselves also socially sustainable. So I think that it was there, but in a particular way, and I'm not sure. I think what's interesting for me, and I feel it's beginning to really finally happen, is this integration of a kind of sense of social sustainability. So it is also about equality, poverty, difference around race and gender and disability, that I see student projects, architecture projects, becoming much more, whereas they used to be big, sustainable buildings were like huge, high-tech sustainable buildings, like big buildings, and now there's just some really interesting projects coming through, which tend to be much more the circular economy, very modest, reuse, not trying to show off, just really thinking about and being very connected to the social to community uses, and that feels very positive to me, that those things are coming along. So I think the connection with social equity is, I guess I want to see it in that, again, I want to see it in that wider way. I think, gender is always something we have to really be careful about, but there are so many other things we also need to intersect.
Absolutely. And is that the sort of the notion of the 15-minute city, kind of bringing that sort of green social equity, access and inclusion all together? Is that?
I'd really like to hear what the other people say. I'm always a bit dubious about. I mean, I think the 15. That's another, the 15-minute city, that's another thing, like, cycling for health and well-being. They're these kind of strap lines that become the thing. And I've certainly seen urban design that's very much around that, but actually does not challenge kind of underlying capitalist assumptions about who lives where and, housing design as individual domestic units. It's not necessarily, I think there are radical versions of it, but I think it's potentially quite a consensus version. No, these are just, taking a falling down community building and working with the people to make it usable, but also sustainable and supporting wildlife and, just a much more kind of subtle set of nuanced relationships, I think. I'm not good on these big picture strap lines. I'm always like, I mean, I don't even like the phrase inclusive city, because I think inclusion is a very problematic term. There's me. I am female, but I'm white and I'm middle class and I'm old, and I can include people. I'm a professional, so I include others. I add them to me, and I'm like, hi. What is that? I don't have to change. I'm just letting them in. It's a ridiculous way of thinking about it. We should shift, completely away from that notion of thinking about the future. That's what I like. The Feminist City doesn't do that. It doesn't say, let's just adapt the city and make it a little bit better for women, or a little bit better for people of colour, or a little bit better for disabled people. It's like we have to rethink.
Absolutely. It's like the idea of equality. I mean, obviously equality is a good thing, but equality with who? Who are you making equal with someone else? If we're always thinking in this very singular model that is built around a specific group of people and asking everyone else to fit into that, then is that radical, is that revolutionary, or is it just going to end up excluding all over again? And Katrine, did you want to jump in on the green issue?
Oh, yes. What was I going to say? Yes. I spoke to a city, large town I didn't speak to the actual town. I spoke to people in charge there in northern Scandinavia just last week, and they had just electrified the bus network, so electrical buses, and a huge expense, but they were very proud of this, and they should be. And this one of the women there also mentioned that she'd run these calculations and figured out that if they had managed to convince the men to go on the bus to the same extent as the women did, the carbon emission saving from that would have been the same as from electrifying the whole network. So that's a behavioral change connected to gender that, could have huge implications. And I mean, now we talk so much about electric vehicles and they're almost this sort of silver bullet. And I think they're this example of something that does not require us to change. It's sort of still, let's behave in the same way and drive in the same way in our individual vehicles, but just let's just swap them to electric. And I mean, we know, and of course, electric cars are better than petrol-driven equivalents and so on. But, why don't we compare them to other forms of transport? Not just biking. I do agree with Jos there. But, there are electric bikes, or there's walking, there's buses, there's public transport. And obviously, those alternatives are much better than electric vehicles. And those investments are not made. I mean, in the UK, we cut bus funding instead. And so these sort of grand ideas, all new cars are electric by 2035. I think in many ways that's an easy target, although it isn't, is these sort of behavioral changes. And many of them have to do with gender, as evident in this sort of story about this Scandinavian city that I heard of just last week, are almost, could be bigger, and they're certainly just as necessary. And I think with, the climate emergency, particularly in the UK, where, a lot of the solutions, we will have to change transport in radical ways in this country, and we need to change how we heat our homes. And I think those things together, there are lots and lots of ties with gender, and particularly with transport, who uses what and why. Okay, women don't bike. Well, why is that? What does that tell us about the biking environment, and how we design that? More men than women today buy electric cars, completely opposite of how it was 120 years ago. Why is that? Why do men not want to go on the bus? So I think all of these changes are connected to these things. And particularly, this was really what struck me when I worked on my book, Mother of Invention, just seeing how shaped by ideas about gender we've been, previously through the history of technology. It really made me think so much about sustainability and how these ideas about men and women and what a woman is and should do and a man is and should do are really blinding us to so much innovation when it comes to sustainability in particular.
And stuff around transport I've found so interesting, that transport policy is still so focused on a man getting into a car at the beginning of the day and then getting out of the car at the end of the day, and not considering the sort of shorter journeys that women make that are kind of more crisscross around because of caring responsibilities and going to the shops and things like that. I also was thinking about buses. One of the things I always remember reading about was in 97 when the Labour women came in. This was the first time you had women in the transport ministry, and it was the first time really then people started talking about buses, because before it was an all-male ministry and transport was roads and building roads and getting more roads. And then as women coming in, it's like, okay, well, you try and get a double buggy on a bus in a busy city centre. We need to be talking about buses.
No, I completely agree. I completely agree. But some of these things also go back to sort of economics and how we see different types of costs. Putting up a big sort of parking garage by the train station, that's, the way that's accounted for, that's like a one-time cost. While obviously a bus service to run it, so it's considered to be more costly often to sort of put a bus up. Or put a bus service up and running. And that's part of the explanation why so many of them have been cut, maybe not so much in cities as in more rural areas in the UK. But again, I think it goes, a lot of it goes back to, what we see as cost and how we account for different things, which is shaped by the exclusion of women and has been for so long.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, I really wanted on this talk to discuss challenges and hopes and what we can do and positive solutions. And I really feel we've had an amazing balance of that. But for my last kind of wrap up question, I thought it'd be really great if you could each sort of talk to one challenge and one solution that you can see in terms of how we can build cities for women and, increase kind of equity and fairness and inclusion in our cities. So Leslie, do you want to go first? It's a big question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big question, but you don't need to be sorry for asking it, because we do have to ask this question. If we could think about one change, maybe again, trying to draw some threads together here around safety, care work, public space, lessons that have come out of the pandemic. You mentioned trying to enjoy socializing in public space, but realizing, many of our cities are not really well set up for that in terms of everything from toilets to shade, shelter, comfortable places to sit. If we started to reimagine the public sphere, both indoor and outdoor, but public spaces in general as spaces for care, for social interdependence, for, mutual aid, for bringing people together, then I think we could potentially, it has ripple effects that transform then what the home is for, right? Maybe we can imagine, again, this future of different ways of working that are not all about the workplace is over here and the home is over here, but work that happens in public spheres as well. So if we can start to break down some of those so rigid and non-functional barriers between what is considered private and what is considered public, both in terms of space and labor, I think that would go a long way towards really, shaking things up and getting us to be creative, right? To think about all of the amazing spaces that we do have, and the in some cases, not radical changes that would have to happen. Putting in new benches and some toilets, right, could be a real improvement in many ways. So, to me, I think we could, if we can think creatively about how to use our public spaces in different ways, that would be one great move towards a feminist city vision.
And I love that idea of thinking about public and private and trying to unpick that and not have them so separate. Jos, what about you? What would be the sort of one positive change you can see for building cities for women?
I think this complements what Leslie said, but I think I'm really focused on the kind of everyday processes and practices that we have and how those get changed. And for me, this really centers on who does get valued, who gets counted, both in terms of the actual costs that have already been talked about really centrally. So we need to be able to mainstream gender budgeting, so we actually have a way of inherently critically and creatively evaluating kind of policy decisions and choices. But I also think it really is in a very everyday way that in terms of thinking about who gets valued, I feel like there's a whole lot of new, different kinds of concepts that we need. I've already been rude about inclusion, but I think, the Disorderly Architecture Project, which looks at how we might really not treat disability as a kind of deficit that's dealt with at the end of a design process and is a kind of, we designed for normal people and then we somehow think we ought to fit in the others at the end. So we use something which is from a disability scholar called Rosemary Garland Thompson, which is about fitting and misfitting. So that when you're looking at thinking about mindsets and assumptions and, phrases like the 15-minute city, it's like, who fits with that and who misfits? It's a relational notion. So you're always looking at where you're making people's lives smoother and where you're making them tougher, but also where in the situation, if you misfit, it's actually, you are always creatively negotiating the built environment because it doesn't work for you. So there's a lot of creative knowledge there that we could make a lot of use of, which we don't, whether that's women, people of colour, working class people, disabled people, queer and transgender people. We're not making use of that as a kind of creative generator either.
Yes, I totally agree. And and it's also so much positivity to come out of thinking of wider ways of thinking about creativity and who has creativity and what does creativity look like and what model are we valuing when we think of creative thinking and what's being ignored. And Katrine, what about you, last but not least?
I certainly second all of what's been said about, particularly around that there is a historic moment now, or a moment at least, where sort of private and public, our conceptions of that within our lives is shifting due to technology and the pandemic and the way the economy is developing. And I think sort of so many of feminist victories in the past have sort of come from some kind of successful renegotiation, between sort of the barriers between private and public. So I do think that is actually a huge opportunity. But I mean, the challenges, which I have mentioned before, was, I think something to think about is, how big tech companies or private companies are shaping cities and environments to a larger and larger extent. And the way that I think policymakers have not felt emboldened to really regulate and shape those developments, whether they are electric scooters or sort of other things. I think that is certainly a challenge for the future, with sort of technology playing a bigger and bigger part, changing our environments and public and private, and that being a sector where women are still, so absent, in spite of women, being, basically inventing computer software back in the day, but nowadays it's different. So I think that's a huge challenge. But apart from that, and I also really see the energy transition and the climate emergency as a well, it's an opportunity, if that's the wrong word, but I hope you understand what I mean.
Yes, I think we have to treat it as an opportunity, don't we? Because if we don't, we're going to go in a very dark place very quickly. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating panel, and my brain is like buzzing with ideas, and I feel like we could just talk for a few more hours. And I wish we were in sort of real life and could all carry on talking into the evening. Thank you everyone who's logged on to watch. I really hope you found this talk as inspiring as I have. Remember that there's going to be plenty more Festival of Future Cities events happening with Bristol Ideas, and to sign up to our newsletter and to follow us on social media to get more information. But last but not least, thank you so much to Jos Boys, Leslie Kern and Katrine Marçal for a brilliant, thought-provoking event. And yeah, I'm excited to see where the future takes us in terms of how we design cities for women and for everyone. Thank you so much.